So many artists get stuck on the idea that they need to make some grand, profound statement with their art in order to make meaningful art or in order to justify the time it takes to pour into a creative practice. But what if I told you that the most profound art you could make is simply documenting your everyday life around you? The benefit is that this art is honest, it's true to who you are, and most importantly, it's accessible in a way that big ideas are not often when you're starting out. In today's video, I am painting this scene. This is a photo that I snapped a few years ago during a Texas ice storm where we knocked out our power grid and we were sort of camping in our bedroom. I remember I had my phone on me, so just a very simple way to document. And something about the sun coming in through the blankets felt really beautiful. Other than that, it just was an honest documentation of my life in that moment. And of course, this collected dust in my camera roll for many years. But in the past week, we geared up for another ice storm and I revisited this image. And what was interesting about it was what felt like such a simple documentation of my life turned into a beautiful painting, a painting that has sold. I'm waiting for it to dry. And so I wanted to share some of my key insights about the importance of painting what is true and honest to you, even if it seems small, and how that can be a great starting point for any artist's career. I only bring up the idea that it's sold because one of the biggest pushbacks I get whenever I make this point to my audience is, well, what if it's only important to you? Which brings me to my first point as to why even the most mundane everyday aspects of your life could be a way to make meaningful art. And it starts way back in like the early 2000s. I was a little kid. We didn't have access to a computer in my house for the vast majority of my childhood. But in order to look things up, we had this set of books. It was called the World Book Encyclopedia. It was printed in my edition was from the 1970s. And I remember I would get bored and I would open up one of the encyclopedia books and I would flip through, and there was a lot of documentation around people's everyday life. But what was so fascinating to me as a kid at that point was that it was everyday life of people in the 1970s. And I remember having this feeling in my gut about, I wish they knew that this was so magical, because the way the fashion was and the ways that the shopping mall looked or the parks, it just looked so distant and foreign in a way that I remember. I just remember thinking, I wish they knew it was special, and that this simple picture of a bunch of people walking in a shopping district was really profound and beautiful to me, 30 years later, looking back. And it's funny because in the moment, it never feels special or important. But I think it's our job as artists to look beyond that jadedness or that over familiarity with our everyday life in order to mine the meaningful moments out of it. And of course, I'll say, you're not doing it right if it doesn't feel a little bit gratuitous in the moment. What I mean by that is, okay, I'm just feeding my cat. Why is my cat eating food out of a bowl with the sunlight hitting it just right? Why is that profound? And the thing is, you don't often know until later. It also brings me to another point that my professor told us when I was in undergrad. And he told us, as we were trying to write artist statements, which are basically these written statements that are there to sort of bridge the gap between the art that you made and what the viewer is intended to gain from the artwork. And he would tell us, it's okay if you don't fully understand what you're making and why you're making it, because if you make enough artwork, if you continue to make art, eventually you'll be able to look back at all those paintings and see a through line or a common theme or a thread. So I think another point that I would want to urge artists is, it may not make sense in the moment, but if you have a gut reaction that it feels important, no matter how small or mundane, listen to that inner voice and trust that in the future, you'll be able to look back and make meaning of that artwork. And even if you're just snapping a photo with your iPhone, don't think that that is too small or too informal. Sometimes when something becomes so accessible, right? Everyone has access to pen and paper. Nowadays, everyone has access to a great little camera in our phone, that because it's widely accessible to everyone, that there's less of a need to make that into meaningful art. I would push back on that. In fact, Susan Sontag, who's one of my favorite thinkers and writers in the art space, wrote about photography that all photographs are memento mori, which is just the fancy art word of saying artwork about death and, end of life, sort of in a way. To take a photograph is to participate in another person's mortality, vulnerability, and mutability. I think the idea is that you snap a photo and what feels like the present moment is gone. And so it's a way for us to invite in living with that moment. To break this down, I remember when I first started painting and having a painting practice, I remember feeling really excited because I could live through a moment twice. I could live through it obviously in the moment, and then I was able to, through the painting, which would take hours or weeks or sometimes months, continue to experience that as I was creating the artwork. This also reminds me of a particular story from the book Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. And there's a story in this book where the student who is trying to learn how to write, I believe, is overwhelmed by the idea of describing something as big as a building. And the instructor tells her to start by describing just the very top left brick, right? The idea that it's the same way that your page of writing starts with the cursor on the top left, and that can feel almost paralyzing. The instructor says, we'll just start with the top left brick, start there. And that act of starting just somewhere, anywhere, it doesn't matter, unlocks the ability to see and create. The same applies to painting or making art. If you feel stuck, just begin by documenting one small part of your life. The corner of your bedroom, a coffee cup, the way the light hits a window. Start there and the rest will follow. A really good tangible analogy for this is, you know, when you have a big thing of duct tape and you're just looking for the edge, you're feeling for it, and once you find the edge, you can just lift up a corner and then it's easy. So much of art making is just looking for that little edge of the duct tape, and then eventually you can sort of go from there. But I always say, like, give honor to the idea that it might take a little bit for you to come up with that idea. Lower the bar, start with the top left brick, right? That brick is not the most important or special part of the building, and you can always cut back and prune back the stuff that doesn't make the final cut. But just by allowing yourself to start somewhere, you cut back on a lot of the overthinking that can happen when it comes to making artwork. I'm gonna give you 4 quick reasons why it's important to document your life. Reason 1, it reduces overthinking. And you don't have to invent something profound. You free yourself to focus on the act of creating. There's a misconception that art has to start with a big idea, but honestly, the best ideas often come from the process itself. Wayne Thiebaud, who is one of my all-time favorite artists, painted pies, cakes, and everyday objects. And he once said, common objects become strangely uncommon when removed from their context and ordinary ways of being seen. An important thing to note about Wayne Thiebaud is that he was popular, his moment was during the mid to late-ish 20th century. And this would have been right about a little bit after the time of the abstract painters. The importance of this is that Wayne Thiebaud was still painting stuff that looked real, right? A slice of pie, a cut up melon. And while he was still painting something that felt very accessible and commonplace, what he was doing with abstracting it was removing it from all of its other contexts and just putting it on a white surface, allowing the viewer to see something that ordinarily would be mundane, right? A slice of pie is part of a tablescape. But by isolating it to itself, we're able to give things that are otherwise very mundane the full focus, and thus revealing a layer of beauty that very mundaneness hides from us. Reason number 2, it's a record of your life. Now, this can be hard if you feel like your life isn't anything special. You grow up middle class in a suburb and you don't do anything particularly unique. You don't have any special interests or hobby. You're just kind of a regular person, right? Hopefully all of us have things that make us feel unique. But when I talk to artists, sometimes when I encourage them to look for something special, they'll sort of hit me with well, I don't feel very special. But in reality, it isn't until we give ourselves the permission to see our life in the way an artist would see our life that we can reveal things about ourselves that are unique and special. This reminds me of the family photos or even the nostalgia TikToks where people look back and say, wow, I wish I could go back to that moment. I didn't know it was so special. Right now, a lot of my TikTok is nostalgia content about 2005 Bath and Body mom with the French acrylic tips. And the funny thing about having lived through that, although I was a younger kid, was that felt very normal, nothing to notice. But the things like the chunky highlights and the acrylic nails and the Bath and Body signature fragrances that are now no longer being produced, is in the moment they felt so normal, but when we look back, we realized there was a specialness, even if they weren't entirely unique. To round out this point, I'm going to take a quote from John Berger's Way of Seeing. He says, "The relationship between what we see and what we know is never fully settled." Documenting your life allows the future viewer and even your future self to recontextualize what was once mundane into something meaningful. Reason number 3, it reveals themes over time. Like I mentioned in the beginning, my painting professor said that eventually you would add up enough data points or paintings or studies or whatever art you're making, and you could look back and be able to see some of the themes. By documenting your life, you're building a record that will reveal patterns, ideas, and obsessions over time. You're essentially creating the roadmap to discover your own artistic voice. We often put too much pressure on ourselves to have these themes, and it can be hard because a lot of times when you see artists on social media or certainly in a gallery or museum setting, they've had the luxury of time and retrospection and curators and art writers synthesizing into words and using context to create meaning out of their artwork. But as a budding artist, you don't always have that luxury of that conversation, and so you're forced to mine meaning for yourself. And when you don't have a lot of data points, aka you're newer, you're still finding out what kind of art you like, it can be really hard, which is why I always recommend having just the basic documentation style of making art as a starting point. You don't always have to paint this way, but it's a good way to sort of respond to art making and begin to create context for yourself as an artist. Reason 4, it makes your art honest and relatable. Art made from everyday life resonates because it's real. It's your life and it's your perspective. It doesn't try to be anything it's not. People connect with authenticity. The Ashcan School of Artists, for example, painted some scenes from everyday urban life, not glamorous or idolized, but honest. Their work is timeless because it speaks to the universal truths and the specific. And to contextualize the Ashcan artists, who are my favorite artists, by the way, I remember in college, I did multiple master studies of John Sloan and some of the other Ashcan artists. And what was interesting about them is that it was during a time in the early 20th century, the late 19th century, when America was really finding its own voice and separating from Paris and London being the epicenter of the art world. And where a lot of American art had really tried to emulate the styles and techniques and tropes and conversations that were being had in Europe, the Ashcan artists said, even if America is still up and coming and rough around the edges, and we're doing things like depicting the homeless, that's where the term ashcan comes from. It was the barrels that used to light trash on fire and keep the homeless warm. Even if we're creating artwork that just simply shows the world as it is, because it's America, because it's who we are, and because it's honest, it's worth making art about. And of course, this body of work by this collective of artists helped to create the permission that the American artists needed to be able to make all kinds of art that would come to represent what it means to be an American artist. All this to say, you don't need to have a profound idea to start making meaningful art. You just need to show up and document your life. Nostalgia, hindsight, finding meaning where perhaps you couldn't see it before are all things that are going to naturally happen out of your artwork. You don't have to sort of force meaning if you don't want to. Of course, I should also include that if you start making art because you have something to say and because you want to say something meaningful, I'm not saying that this more humble and authentic way of making art is better. I'm simply saying that a lot of times it can be really intimidating to see all these artists with these fully fleshed out artist statements and these sort of political bends to their art taking on establishment and taking on norms in our culture, which is great. And I definitely consider myself an artist who has a lot of bodies of work that does seek to do that. But the way I got there was by allowing myself to simply be a witness in my own life and use that as a starting point, where it allowed me to have a starting point if I did want to pick up the mantle and start to say things that had heavier or deeper meaning. But by no means, and this is the ultimate point of this video, do you have to start with that. It is okay to just say, this is my life, this is how I see it. In fact, I know plenty of artists and curators and collectors who prefer that kind of art. So don't overthink it, simply show up. And if you are watching this in the beginning of 2025, this is your encouragement to don't overthink it. Look through your iPhone camera roll, take a pencil and paper, walk around your house, walk around your neighborhood, and try to look at your world through the eyes of an artist. And hopefully that fresh look at your environment will invite a little bit of that art magic into your own practice and give you a more prolific and fruitful year of creating in 2025.